Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Tomasz. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we go into the heart of our conversation, I do like to ask all of my guests something about their origin story. So it'd be great to hear from you in your own words, what you studied at university, and was it inevitable you'd end up in finance and with this larger focus on geopolitics and geoeconomics and so on?
Okay, so it's a long series of all roads lead to finance, right? Hopefully not all roads, and mine was a bit of a zigzag. I started studying what I actually wanted to study, which was, believe it or not, cognitive semantics, cognitive sciences. And then I quickly found out that I had to study something to get a job, and that was economics and MPA, upon which I landed my first job. And that sent me actually to an industry, mining industry. And it's in the mining industry that I connected with the financial market for the first time. And then, as it often happens, through osmosis, started kind of gravitating, did my CFA and joined the first hedge fund, and have been managing books for hedge funds and family offices ever since, but specifically focusing on mining and commodities and mining equities and this sort of sub-universe. So a lot of macro overlay as it is commodity markets. So interest rates matter and currencies matter, but the real stuff behind it and the value generation matters a lot more. And so that's the approach.
Okay, that's fantastic. And it's through a podcast of your own called Tyranny Now that I learned about your thinking and how you look at the world. And I found it very, very original, the way you look at geopolitics, geostrategy, and so on. So hence inviting you onto the podcast. So now I can see you have a commodities background that necessarily forces you to really have your finger on the pulse in terms of global events.
Yeah, it's very global. So anybody who's interested in the world more broadly than just a couple of major capitals should touch exactly that area, commodities, because it takes you out of your comfort zone to regions and jurisdictions that you would otherwise never visit, right? Not even as a tourist. And so you learn how business functions in those places, how people function, what's the economic behavior of different groups in different parts of the world. And it's very enriching, because one risk that I always see in our industry among people who do not have that access is that their world becomes flat, but flat through the Bloomberg screen. And that's unhelpful, because you don't actually realize what the value creation is behind what real people are actually doing. So I think commodity business is one of those that you have that opportunity to reach out both vertically and horizontally and kind of deepen the view beyond this squiggle that we see on our Bloomberg screens every day.
And I noticed that you're very well traveled as well. You tend to go, into the field, so to speak. You tend to look at local sources of information as well, not just the traditional kind of Western media outlets and so on to gather your insights and information.
Yeah, that's almost inevitable in this space. The difference between commodity business, or at least, let's say, minerals and fossil fuels, is that they are where they are, regardless of what the human construction is above ground. So you have to actually go to those places to understand what's going on, to understand the operational excellence or lack thereof, all the risks that have to overlay the future cash flow projections and so on. It's almost inevitable. It's slowed down since COVID, I'd say. The world is a bit different. The world also has shrunken quite a lot in terms of what's available. When I think about the past, how much time I spent in West Africa and elsewhere, well, it's a tricky place to go right now. And a lot more countries are in a stage of war, internal conflict, and so on than ever before. So, and many of those conflicts have also this sort of more global extension. So you have to kind of find out, what different forces are that pull in different directions in this post-globalized world. So things got a little more complicated. The market is more fragmented, and some of the commodity markets are going in the direction of almost semiconductors. So a very clear bifurcation between East and West. Whereas in semiconductors, definitely the weight, the gravity is on the Western side of the divide. So say US, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, the Netherlands. On the commodity side, especially in critical minerals space, which are absolutely necessary for new technologies, both in energy transition and defense, The power is on the other side. So it's China and Russia and often their allies, from Myanmar to Venezuela. So it's also a world that's being fragmented increasingly, and you have to actually adapt your thinking. It's no longer so this global thing where back in the day I could go to 100 different jurisdictions. Right now, when I look at my portfolio, it's 5 or 6. You're very selective to reduce the potential risk of the unpredictability. And there's so much unpredictable in the stuff that's in the ground. You don't want to compound it with stuff that's above the ground.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah. So I wanted us to focus on geopolitics, from your perspective. Let's start with Trump. He obviously won the election, second administration. He obviously has a certain way of relating to the rest of the world. One is through tariffs. He seems to imply he's more of an isolationist or less inclined to use war or military to sort of gain advantage abroad. But what's your thoughts on how whether he'll make a difference to U.S. foreign policy, or how should we think about like a change in administration in the U.S.?
So I'll give you a grid that I use for that, which is very simple because it comes from linear algebra. If you look at what drives the different change of situations and pressures in a global political marketplace, there are 3 things. One is the structures, the pre-existing structure that exists both the national and international. The second is the agency of leaders, and the third one is the sort of random error, right? The contingency that you cannot really predict. And so, if you look at what we know so far with the first appointments of the incoming administration, it's going to be less of a structure with some destruction of the structure. It's going to be a lot of agency. Think Justin Trudeau, right? Flying to Mar-a-Lago the other day, just 4 days after President-elect's recent tweet that affected both Mexico and Canada. And the random error is what it is. But so we have to focus on this agency side. We don't know what's going to happen to the structures. That's a question for Elon Musk and whoever's going to chop, $1 trillion from deep state. But on the agency side, it's really interesting because that's exactly where your question could be directed. Is like, what does it mean? What does those preferences actually mean? And there are 2 ways to look at it. One is, of course, that this is purely transactional, that everything is what Max Weber would call zweckrationell, right? So just basically there's some goal and it goes in this direction, either on trade or security or anything else. But that should not preclude a conjecture that there is also some ideological side to this. It's something that the president-elect deeply believes in. And if you look at his past statements, and that goes back to decades because he's been a public persona for decades now, there are areas in which he's very overt. One is his low level of comfort with international trade as it stands, right? So global trade, he views it as a kind of a zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers. Ironically, in the way that the global trade has developed in the last 20 years, there is 1 or 2 grains of truth in this, right? So you have this major imbalance that countries, say, China, 17% of global GDP, but 31% of global manufacturing, most of the trade being, of course, in manufacturing. And then you have countries like US, they're on the other side, basically lending their demand to the countries that benefit from current account surplus that has its incidence on the capital account and so on. So trade is one when there are real beliefs, real values. So decisions are more wertrationell, to use again Weberian model. The second one I would say is nativism. So some of the uglier things that were said during the election about illegal immigrants and so on, that also seems to be a deeper conviction. Now, I'm of the view that, of course, immigration should be managed and not mismanaged. So that's no different in a classic country of immigration like the United States. So a lot needs to be done with it. But certain ways in which this was put across is quite, I have some misgivings about how that was put forward, especially in the context of a multiracial, multi-ethnic country. And so what does it mean for in terms of international relations? Well, there are those countries that are trembling right now because of their current account surpluses, Canada and Mexico first, and I'm talking just about the allies, Germany and Japan second. And what is much worse is that in that transactional space, there is also room to rejig certain security arrangements. And here's the countries that are concerned, not because of a trade surplus, but because of their security position that's been undermined by the last couple of years of sort of the unraveling of a global system. And that's South Korea, there's Taiwan, there's Poland, there's potentially Finland, Romania, and some others. And so, what could happen here? One is that this is purely transactional, and therefore there will be just some give and take, and we pass on. And at the end of the day, it will be just minor rigging of a global space, a little bit like in between 2016 and 2020. But the second one, which is much more concerning, is that the new administration will enter some kind of a grand bargain. So kind of a concert of powers, right? So exactly what some of the ideologues in Moscow would love to see. So here is a couple of those big powers, and they will decide together what the future of the lesser players are. So spheres of influence and so on. So if you think about from the perspective of the value-driven convictions, potential convictions that President-elect may have, well, that's actually good news for Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, because there is no trade bone with these countries, right? U.S. doesn't have a trade bone. It doesn't necessarily have, immigration bone with them either. It's a bit more complex in the case of China, but it's extremely bad news for all of those countries that feel threatened by, the rising powers, and especially, China and Russia and their respective geostrategic regions. So a lot of instability.
So this puts a lot of the, I guess, so-called allies under pressure then.
Yeah, it does. This starts, of course, with claims about low contribution for defense and so on. It's definitely true to some extent for some of those economies and some of those countries. However, many of those have evolved their entire security system based on long-term pre-existing treaties, right? Article 5 in case of NATO, bilateral relations in Asia Pacific. If that unravels, then this multipolar chaos will be very damaging. Let's not forget that puts U.S. in the basket of revisionist powers. So there are two types of revisionism. There is the economic revisionism, which is, for example, exactly what Trump preaches in terms of his attitude to trade, how this is organized around the world. And then there is the geostrategic revisionism, which is China's case. And then Russia, that basically plays on both keyboards here. This is the world in which, world in transition. So we don't know yet what kind of new arrangement will evolve out of this, but a lot of uncertainty in the next 4 years. As if I were to worry about something, is about this very fidgety, intemperate early morning tweets that can change a lot of things, not just in the market. We obsess about markets and what we do, but there's this other reality out there. And if you compare what greed can do to you as a driver and what insecurity can do to your driver, then of course the latter is much more subliminal and much more limbic, and kind of makes you act a lot faster. So this is a significant source of insecurity over and above, weird stuff like yesterday in Korea. I'm sorry, but just completely unexpected things that can happen. Some of this is related to the sense of insecurity that's rising among a lot of countries, especially in what Nicholas Spickman called the rimland. So those smaller countries around the heartland being the core of Eurasia. That's kind of the geopolitical thinking that unfortunately we have to kind of dust off. No, it usually means dusting off 19th century readings.
Right. And so if we zoom into something like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, so obviously that has been going on for a number of years. People have views around, who's winning, who's losing, but how should we think about that conflict now?
So at this stage, we're talking early December 24. There are three levels here. One is the actual war. The second one is hopes for a ceasefire, plans for a ceasefire. And the third one is a long-term solution, long-term settlement. On this last one, you really only hear ideas from Russia right now. And so let me just take them one by one. When you look at the war itself has always three levels. So the tactical, operational, and strategic level. At the tactical level, it's more of the same. Nothing much is happening. There's a little bit of the progress of the Russian army, especially in Donetsk and Pokrovsk and Bakhmut and Kupiansk and so on. It doesn't really change the picture that much. On the operational side, it's also been a while since we haven't seen asymmetric escalation from the Ukrainian side. Back in the day, they would attack the Kerch bridge in Crimea. There were some, attacks and successful on the Black Sea. There was, of course, this incursion into Kursk, which is still standing, but right now it's kind of a tactical thing, and their elite troops are maintaining this. So nothing much happening there. But at the strategic level, the escalatory ladder that belongs to Russians. Russians are very good at intensifying the conflict at the strategic level. That launch of the MIRV, so the multiple integrated targeted reentry vehicle into Dnipro that you saw the other day. So potentially, hypersonic missile with multiple warheads. That was a signaling, of course, way beyond Ukraine. There was a signaling to the West. The hybrid war in all of its colors, cutting the, alleged because it's all deniable, but cutting the optical wires under the Baltic Sea and attacks on the GPS in Finland and Estonia, and then disrupting phone connections in Denmark as the Chinese vessel was detained or was planned to be detained, the Chinese vessel that's apparently responsible for cutting those optic fibers in the Baltics, and so on and so forth, right? Disruptions to rail transportation in Denmark. There's a lot of hybrid activity. So that initiative belongs to Russia right now. And so it almost, it invites us to jump straight to the long-term solution before we speak about the ceasefire. So let's do that. It really looks to me like Russians have not abandoned their December 21 set of demands that were addressed at NATO at that point, which basically meant rolling back the losses in terms of their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. So integrating Ukraine in some form of lesser sovereignty, and then kicking out NATO troops of Eastern Europe. Of course, the 2.5 years of the war in Ukraine have seen exactly the opposite, sort of extension of NATO in Finland and in Sweden. By the way, one of the U.S. think tanks that supported Trump's re-election, Center for Renewing America, was very critical of that, of the expansion of NATO into Finland and Sweden. So let's see what happens with that going forward. But nothing has changed in terms of Russia's claims to its sphere of influence, a sphere of control even, so something that's more...
So Russia, you don't think well, at least overtly, they're not saying they're comfortable with just retaining what they've occupied and leaving the rest to Ukraine?
Well, there are a lot of different ideas. The number one is to retain this occupied terrain, but number two is to leave Ukraine in some kind of a rump form with very limited sovereignty, demilitarization, denazification, change of government, essentially sort of vassalization of the country. But there are, obviously, there's a whole domino theory with Moldova and other countries there that would be extremely fragile if that were to happen. We're seeing what's happening in Georgia, right? So there's a lot of spillover. How could that be achieved? So it's good to read actually some of the Russian writers. Sergei Karaganov is one who actually strongly suggests use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, to actually bring Europe to its knees. And he sees, of course, Trump's election as an opportunity for Russia to actually expand, or as realists would say, secure its interests, its security interests. And then you have other writers, Russian writers, Fyodor Lukyanov or Vasily Kashin, that maybe do not go in this direction, but very strongly advocate even a stronger relationship between Russia and China going forward. So the idea is that sometimes permeated through the Biden administration, pacifying Russia and introducing this reverse Kissinger dialogue, whereby Russia could be satisfied with some minimal gains, and then a wedge should be driven between Russia and China. That's unlikely to happen with the current leadership and current thinking in Moscow and in Beijing as well. So these long-term plans, I think, again, the initiative was on the Russian side. So what about the ceasefire then, somewhere in the middle? First, we don't know what it actually means on the ground. Is this some kind of a buffer zone, and who's responsible for the buffer zone? Let's not forget buffer zones are usually asymmetric, so they are usually buffering one side against the other. And there's a variety of different ideas who should man that say DMZ, right? Like in Korea or in Cyprus and somewhere. And of course, there's not much enthusiasm about Western troops being sent to the area. But there are two risks for Ukraine proper with the idea of a ceasefire. Number one, Russian burn rate is a lot higher than Ukraine's. It's a larger country with larger resources, but they've lost, by recent count, 10,000 vehicles in 2.5 years, of which about, I think, 3,600 tanks, and they produce only about 1,500 a year, right? So stopping the war allows them to rearm very quickly and much faster than Ukraine. And Ukraine, in whatever form of cooperation with the Western allies and whatever security guarantees that could be brought. And so that's the first problem. The problem is that Chapter 3 would be so much easier to reopen by a much more prepared Russia functioning within its constant war economy. So not re-establishing a normal civilian economy system, but keeping what it is with the increased dependence on civilian product imports from China. But the second source of risk is for the Ukrainian politics, because depending how this ceasefire is engineered and what it actually means, there could be a lot of recrimination within the sort of political sphere in Ukraine. The elections are long overdue. It could be that Zelensky goes down the way Churchill did after Second World War, and it would be quite simple for Russia to drive the wedge and sort of play different candidates there for Russia's own advantage. There will be voices in Ukraine, especially if there is a recognition the war was lost. Right, so not straight surrender, but some form of loss of territory, loss of 80,000 at least human lives. These recrimination may change completely the political climate in Ukraine, and there is no guarantee that this rump Ukraine, especially if, let's say, if the military forces have to be demobilized, or maybe they'll move abroad in some form of additional chip that the West would have on Russia's further expansion. That could lead to reorientation of Ukraine's politics, the way we see it in Eastern Europe in certain countries. Of course, it's happened already in Hungary and Slovakia. It may be happening right now in Georgia. Romania is suddenly unstable. Bulgaria has gone through 7 elections in 2 years, right? So you'll have that strong impact. And I think this recognition that you cannot really count on the West, that could be something that could be a narrative that wins over time. Sometimes I'm wondering, one country I don't know very well, being there once, is Hungary. Why is Hungary actually playing this role of kind of an entry point for both Russia and China into the European politics and the economic sphere as well? And maybe we have to go back to 1956 and Soviet invasion. And this was a taboo topic until end of 1980s, but then suddenly Hungarians could start speaking about it. And what happened then is that, Voice of America was egging people on fighting, right? Just go and defend your democracy and your freedom against the Soviet invasion, so on. But the West was distracted by the Suez Canal crisis and other things, and there was nobody there that was ready to help Hungarians. And so probably that recognition, that's not going to be different in Armenia and Georgia, many countries. Nobody's going to come and help us. So maybe we should just settle with the big power next door, which has this track record. And, that there is no guarantee, I think, depending, of course, on how the West and US and NATO will play that. There is no guarantee that a ceasefire in Ukraine will kind of solidify Ukraine as a Western player, a pro-Western player in future.
Okay. And what does this mean for the European Union then? Because obviously the US, or at least Trump, is trying to force more of the risk over to Western Europe. Germany, we've got an election sort of coming up, partly in due to how to fund support for Ukraine. France politically is unstable at the moment as well. I mean, what's Europe's position in this?
There is a continuum of outcomes about which we'll know very little until the election in Germany, or you're just pointing it out. So that will be one of the determinant drivers. Within this continuum, number of options, but there are two extremes. One extreme is Draghi's report, right? When was it? 2 months ago? September, right? Mario Draghi's report, which shows exactly the way forward. So first, building a common capital market. in Europe so that Europe can really reindustrialize, rearm, reindustrialize. We see the reluctance, especially in Germany and the Netherlands and Sweden, to mutualize their creditworthiness and share it with other countries. I think Friedrich Merz said yesterday in Bundestag that he doesn't want the spreads on German Bund to and the decision whether to cut budget or not be depending on the market, as it is the case right now in France, right? So there's definitely a resistance to it, but without a very bold movement ahead, which we had only one precedent, which was during COVID, this is unlikely to happen, and therefore the resources will not be pulled and will be very, very limited. So that's one extreme that will be very positive if Europe went in this direction. Depends really on the political decisions in Germany and France and so on. The negative side, so let's the ultimate nightmare scenario is, it's 120 years now since the Berlin Conference. Remember this, 1884, 1885, which is marked with this Scramble for Africa label. So the Europe was dividing the world, right? In fact, this was actually a bit of crowning and flag waving of the scramble. It's like Woodstock for flower power. It was like the end. But it matters as a sort of the symbolic sphere. Right now is the world dividing Europe, right? The other around. So Russia and China trying to do it. Of course, Trump administration, let's not forget, Trump was a big fanatic of Brexit. So the disruption of the integration in Europe seems to be in his interest. So bits and pieces could be peeled away, just like, Serbia and Hungary represent those entry points to the to China and to Russia. There could be some that the new America could also leverage against European Union's remaining powers, for example, as a trade bloc, right? And so what does it mean? It means different things depending where you are in Europe. Europe is not a continent, it's a peninsula. It's a peninsula of Eurasia. And so you have different security interests and different prosperity interests. And again, we are in fear and greed, and what matters more? Well, it depends where you are. And of course, if you are in the eastern part of the European continent, security matters because of Russia. And in the southern part, security matters because of the immigration pressure. And if you're in the northwestern part, prosperity probably matters more, although with the entry of Sweden and Finland, that also changes in terms of the northern approach. So very dependent how America will play this, the Biden interlude was helpful. I don't think enough has been done to actually coordinate the policies. The transatlantic trade treaty was not really moved forward. It seems like the far progressive left in the US has the same isolationist drivers in terms of trade policy as the far right, the populist far right, which probably together makes a majority of the population here. Bad news for connectivity, economic connectivity between Europe and the US, and between US and Asia as well. So it's hard to be optimistic, but we probably, to answer your question, we have to wait for German elections and the new government in France, probably.
Yeah. And you mentioned China a few times. So first of all, China in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war, how are they involved? Because the outsider would say China is basically providing armaments to Russia and allowing Russia to circumvent sanctions, providing goods into Russia. And so there's this kind of perspective that China's sort of backing Russia. Is that a fair characterization, or is there something more going on?
So it's a fair characterization. I think what's unfair is to say that Russia is somehow being vassalized by China, because people who do not know Russia very well tend to underestimate its power because of GDP. Russia has cards to play with China. First, as a nuclear power, and especially in the context of rising stakes between US and China. Russia has the geography, and Russia has the commodities. Russia has a lot of different levers, and I think Moscow has also played its hand very well with some of the players that were viewed as completely dependent on China. I mean, North Korea is the best example, right? That move by North Korea and Russia to establish much stronger security partnership, in a way, abolished or discontinued a period of about 10 years where the entire escalation initiative in the Western Pacific belonged to Beijing. It's no longer the case, right? Because that far north wing of the theater is now a little more unpredictable for Beijing, because North Korea has sort of clinched an additional source of support and can play between the two powers. Not the two countries do not agree eye to eye on everything, and of course you pointed out, subcomponents and a lot of technology that's been flowing into Russia. And of course, it's enough to look at the trade account between the two countries, how it was transformed completely in the last 2.5 years, right? So without China, of course, that effort wouldn't be possible, would not have been possible for Russia. And also in terms of informational war, there are parts of the world where the Chinese activity, both diplomatic and covert and so on, is much stronger than Russia's. They definitely, when I hear certain snippets, they sound like they're taken from Russian propaganda, but they're actually promoted by the Chinese, say, anti-colonial attitude. This is actually interesting because that existed in 1950s and 1960s until the Sino-Soviet split. But in terms of what we call now global South and what we used to call emerging markets, and before their third world, so during the third world era, the actual split between the Chinese and Russian anti-colonial narrative happened in 1973 during a conference in Algiers where Zhou Enlai attacked Soviet Union for being one of those colonial powers, believe it or not. And we, proudly here fighting colonials. So Soviet Union is this industrial country and we the developing countries. So interesting enough, right now there is no split between the two. So they both trying to play on those anti-colonial reminiscences in different parts of the world, Africa, Southeast Asia, to a lesser extent Latin America as well. And so anti-Americanism is, of course, what is just forms an important part of that narrative, solidifying the universe of meaning, which to many of us is quite alien, not least because Russia is conducting a neo-colonial war itself, right? But it's a very strong partnership at the moment. China is benefiting from the war this way or another. So whatever the outcome, it has been a sort of a positive thing. I don't think there is a much downside from the Belt and Road Initiative, rail-based trade going through Belarus and Ukraine, not much of a loss there. So overall, I believe that no matter what the outcome will be, it will be positive for China. But there's a lot of people in Russia trying to think how to structure this relationship once the war is won in some form by Moscow, in order not to allow the Russian economy to be completely subjugated to the interest of China. And so it's funny, I actually just got back from Brazil. So little parenthesis there. For many operations, industrial operations in Brazil, you need industrial chemicals, and there used to be a very strong industrial chemical industry there, a sector that empowered a lot of industrial development, especially in the south of the country. That has been in crisis in the last 2 years. Why? Because of the Ukrainian war. Like, how is that connected, right? It's pretty far. Well, it is disconnected because much of what you generate in chemical industry comes from natural gas. And Russia sells natural gas very cheaply to China. So China is now very competitive selling those chemicals and sort of undercutting the domestic production in Brazil. So this is how far-reaching the relations and the dislocations can be. And once you deindustrialize and you start losing human capital, it's very difficult to reindustrialize. You don't have to look further than Nebraska and Oklahoma.
Okay, yeah. And then more broadly on China, it seems like it's bipartisan in the US that they want to tame China in different ways. The Democrats have one way of doing it, the Republicans may have another way, but both basically don't want China to emerge as a superpower. So how do you think about that relationship? I guess now that we have Trump as well, I mean, how will that relationship evolve?
Yeah, so that depends how you define superpower. So one is the revision is related to trade, right? And I don't think there's much understanding in the incoming administration what it actually means. And why am I saying this? Last weekend, there was this tweet in which the president-elect said that if the BRICS countries stop using the dollar, we'll sanction you. Well, it's either or. Either you rewire the current account relationships in which other countries right now accumulate a lot of dollars so they can use them in capital account, or you generate current account surplus, in which case the dollar will naturally lose its importance, especially on the trade account, but by definition also longer term in the capital account. So either one or the other. I don't think there's a common view on how to achieve that, even though, as I said before, the rebalancing of some of those imbalances is a good thing. Not only because it hasn't happened just by inertia, right? So a lot of these imbalances are actually planned. I mean, a good example in China is Shuang, so dual circulation, which China makes other economies completely dependent on their products and becomes its own economy is internally independent of inflow. So in a way, that's not how global trade should be organized. The global trade should be organized is that you export something in order to import something else, right? In China, it's almost the opposite. You import the absolute minimum, so commodities and some high tech, in order to export just about everything at different level of technological advancement. So that is definitely generating a lot of consensus, as you say, bipartisan consensus, what to do about it. But China is not only a trade problem, it's a security problem. And it's a security problem in the Pacific, and that, of course, brings us to a much bigger issue. Since Pearl Harbor, the United States saw its security as sort of securing United States shores meant securing the opposite shore of the ocean, if you know what I mean. So NATO over Atlantic, and then treaties with ROC, South Korea, and Japan after the war. And that has not changed. That is still important in the Pacific, Western Pacific theater. It means essentially the securing of the first island chain, and that's number one problem, because it's a creed of the Communist Party of China that Taiwan is this unfinished element of the Chinese Civil War, which is a total misnomer because there never was a civil war in Taiwan, right? The Civil War started in 1927. Taiwan was part of Japan, not China. So, but let's leave it aside and ask ourselves, how important is this for the U.S.? And so it's important from, I say, three angles to confront China over its ambitions in the West Pacific. Number one, as I mentioned, is security. It has its military dimension. So the fact that Chinese assets cannot easily enter deep ocean, and deep ocean means that you can hear everything. And unlike in the case of Ukraine, when you have some Republicans claiming, well, it's Europe's interest, and it's not quite on the edge of the water, right? So you have Poland and Germany and Netherlands and France and so on before it becomes a problem for the United States. Well, between Taiwan and the U.S. is just fish. So it's much closer in a way. And the way that especially submarines operate these days, that deep water and hydrophones allow you to know exactly what's happening through that entire body of water, as opposed to the waters between the first island chain and the Asian mainland, which are very noisy, very, very shallow. And so far, the Chinese assets have been cantoned to that. So the first island chain sits on that sort of massive drop. And so that's technologically important, militarily important. The second thing is that the world has changed in the last 2 years, and that's because of our favorite acronym AI. Until 22, China was the number one exporter of AI goods around the world. It's been now long dethroned by Taiwan. So in the last 2 years, the nature of the value chain with the advancement in that you see in those $3.6 trillion worth of NVIDIA market value, it's all based on an ecosystem of about 60 Taiwanese companies. It's completely new. It's not related to TSMC. It's not related to, it's just the entire infrastructure, the entire ecosystem is entirely concentrated in Taiwan. Loss of market by China and Korea. And so the different assessments, what loss of this would mean for global technology, but it's not good. And of course, that connectivity is very strong with Orange County and California. And the third area is, if we do care about the allies, and it's a question mark, then of course Japan and Korea are instantly threatened in terms of their access to energy and goods and trade, global trade, if the first island chain is lost, right? So to some extent, of course, affects the Philippines as well. So yes, there is a consensus, but what does it mean in practical terms? Well, that depends, of course, what the activity by China is. If and there are different levels here. The hybrid activity and this sort of aggression that's been ongoing. It's a fact of life. There's a lot of cyber attacks and activity through social media and trying to corrupt the political class in Taiwan proper, not with much success, but some. And so that's ongoing. There's nothing new about it. And then you have three different sort of steps, starting from a quarantine, which is law enforcement, right? So basically determining that waters around Taiwan belong to People's Republic. This is something that China did in East China Sea in 2013 with ADIZ, which they declared over waters that belong to Korea and Japan. And so the world said, no, we don't agree with this. But the reality is that civilian aircraft, when they pass through those areas, they actually report to the Chinese guards, we're flying through your ADIZ. So de facto, China has succeeded in expanding their footprint there, or fish print. And so that will be kind of a law enforcement, and very difficult to know how to react to this, mostly a Coast Guard. And then the next step is a blockade. And blockade is, potentially kinetic. It's the Navy, and it's a question, what do you do with this? And then you have also invasion. So different types of aggression. Aggression doesn't mean war. Hitler's aggression over Czechoslovakia in 38, 39 did not translate into war. Hitler's aggression against Poland did, right? So that's the difference. So how Taiwan first responds to this, and by extension, Japan and the United States, that would determine if there is a war or not. There's one area where I would caution very much BRICS countries, because they seem to be obsessed about undermining the dollar, the role of the dollar globally. And I don't think they're going to be very successful if it's up to the Chinese to externalize their yuan, because they don't want to lose control over the cost of capital in their country. So that's not going to happen. And I don't think India would like to use it. A basket's not going to work. It hardly works in the case of euro and how, integrated those economies are, much less between Brazil and India, say. So the third option is digital currency. And here, it's an unknown. But I would caution them against it. If you think about the last 30 years, especially during the 30 years of globalization, what the US usually did when it confronted a crisis somewhere, local crisis, so with some exceptions like the Iraqi war, the Afghan war, most of the time it was through sanctions. And that was because of the role of the dollar and the fact that dollar transactions sooner or later have to transit through a US bank. And so everything, Gaddafi, Saddam, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Assad, Russia, finally, right? So there's certain deflation in that. Every time you use it, you kind of lose some of that ammo, but it's still an ammo. And so depriving US of that ammo increases the risk of a kinetic conflict. And so my view is that it's a dangerous game to play. It's almost in the interest of BRICS countries to leave it as it is. And when you listen to Lula and others, you realize they're just as economically illiterate as some of the people in Trump's team. So that probably is not going to go.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. Now, we haven't talked about the Middle East. Obviously, over the past year, there's been an escalation of conflict within the region. It started off Israel versus the Palestinians, and now suddenly it's Lebanon, Syria. There's talk of regime change in Iran. It's really gone from 0 to 100 across the region. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, good question. I think what we're observing this year is a real total gestalt switch in the region, and I would call it with just one word. It's a post-Soleimani world. So you might remember Qasem Soleimani was assassinated by the U.S. in Baghdad, by the way, in early 2020. He was the head of the Revolutionary Guards. Why am I bringing him up? And why we're talking about 24 and not 2020, his physical demise? Qasem Soleimani was the architect of what the Iranians called Jang Ghair Classique, so non-classic war, or irregular warfare, maybe like this. And he knew the history of the Persian Empire very well. And he looked at it and he saw how weak the Iranian military has been. Artesh, the general, like the armed forces of Iran, when you fly F-5s still from 1970s. And instead of doing this, he decided to use the avant-garde, the different sentinels of groups that for historical or religious reasons feel some allegiance to Iran's leadership. Right? This is very difficult to exact in the Sunni world, but it's a lot easier with the Ziyads in Yemen or Ismailis in Lebanon or Alawites in Syria, and so on, the Shiites in general, right? And so these tentacles went everywhere where Sasanian Empire did. That's why Yemen, right? You think, why so far? But if you look at the Sasanian map from the third century, Yemen was part of the Sasanian Empire. Not contiguous, but it was. And of course, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and the whole arc there. And so this has been now all but dismantled by Israel. Especially, Israel was unprepared for Hamas's attack, but was very well prepared to fight Hezbollah since the 2005 debacle in southern Lebanon. And so that has changed completely the power play, the balance of power. Hence Assad's weakness, which is being now exploited by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in northwestern Syria with their Turkish backers. So we're seeing it's sort of an emergence of a new world. I think Iran will probably send troops, or is already sending troops to back Assad, because that's too much of a loss. But the undermining of its Soleimani system, where the country, or the regime at least, could feel relatively safe by not being forced to fight in the homeland, but sort of projecting power elsewhere through its long post-imperial, but those sentinels out there, that has been significantly weakened. Now, having said that, over a year, 14 months of fighting by IDF leaves me with an impression that Israel is devoid of vision, devoid of long-term political strategic vision. It's a small country with very little strategic depth, which is fighting essentially a military operation with very little thought, unless it's something really scary, very little thought how to organize the world in the Middle East the day after, whatever that means the day after. And so a small country has very few options. Of course, it's easy to say, well, you have this big brother on the other end of the Atlantic that helps, but you still need cooperation with one of the three key regimes here. I'm not really counting Egypt, but I count Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in some form. But let's not forget, the pre-revolutionary Iran was a strong ally of Israel. I don't think there is much thinking behind this. How this world should look. I think there's a lot of short-termism there. I think the elite is trying to just push over the reckoning over what happened on October 7. Who's responsible for it in Israel, for the entire Hamas phenomenon, right? Why was that supported for so long by Israel, and since the very beginning, since before Sheikh Yassin created this in 1987, right? So it's a very difficult picture right now, and of course the Syria quagmire makes it even more blurry. You have three parties there. You have Kurds in the U.S. You have the Turkish side with HTS, and of course you have the Alawites without much of a Hezbollah support. And I always remind everybody that Hezbollah used to fight Hamas during the first Syrian war. And again, it's usually forgotten, the US cooperated with Hezbollah in order to fight ISIS. And ISIS was one group that never targeted Israel. So that's something that we should keep in mind if the Syrian war intensifies.
Now you mentioned, Israel, hasn't got a plan with the larger regional powers, but we had the Abraham Accords, which was effectively an alliance with Saudi and obviously UAE. Doesn't that sort of signal they do have something with Saudi, or have the events of the past year changed all of that?
Yeah, I think you always have the elite and the street. So right now, after this year, I'm not really referring even to what happened in Lebanon, but especially to the way in which Israelis conducted their war on the ground in Gaza. That's it will be very difficult for the regime in Saudi Arabia to engineer something officially right now with Israel, with the current governments. Something quite dramatic would have to happen. Maybe the death of the patriarch, the king. Who knows? I don't see this happening near term unless the new crew in Washington has a plan for that. But I saw that Jared Kushner is actually going to be ambassador to Paris, so it's a different type of sinecure. I'm not holding my breath on that. In the longer term, it would make sense for Israel to find common ground with Saudi Arabia. Of course, the economic relations are there, but not at the diplomatic level, not on an official level. And I think it depends a lot on what happens in Iran and how Iran will play the Syrian war, to what extent that might or might not also drag the Saudis. So the Pandora's box has been opened. It's being kept open by Israel. Israel really tried to drag United States into a conflict with Iran. Kudos for to Biden administration for not allowing themselves to be dragged into this. So I think the next chapter.
Actually, on that Iran war, I mean, do you think there could be an Iran war, between Israel and Iran, and then the US does end up getting involved?
So I never underestimate how busy the Swiss embassy in Tehran can be passing on messages from Washington. It does look to me that the restraint has been on the Iranian side. And so there are definitely voices within Israel that somehow a military upheaval, giving the weakness of Artesh, of the armed forces in Iran, would somehow help topple the regime. I have no signs of that, number one. Number two, the two things within Iranian society. One is, very strong displeasure with the economic situation, with the regime as such, and just the internal situation is the way it is. But there is a certain level, maybe not Russian level, but kind of a post-imperial pride in terms of Iran's influence around the region, especially since that Iraqi war debacle by the United States, and the space that it opened for Iran in the region. So people engage usually in the conversation saying that these are our brethren, we should support them, and we should protect them against the bad Sunnis or what have you. So I would not go as far as to claim that here's a revolution coming because Israeli bombs are falling in Iran and therefore everything is solved overnight. I think it's more complex than that. But there will be an opportunity for some refreshment, especially after Khamenei's passing, right? And that's probably in the next couple of months.
Yeah, and we've talked about lots of hot sort of geopolitical spots. What worries you the most out of everything that we've talked about? Or was there something else that's worrying you?
No, I think what worries me is those intemperate, fidgety tweets every morning. Okay. That could very quickly destabilize entire regions of the world. Think about the messaging from Trump regarding Taiwan. It's very undisciplined. It's factually incorrect. Taiwan has stolen our technology. Well, the U.S. never produced a 2-nanometer semiconductors, right? And might never. If there is a country that might catch up, is Japan. So that kind of messaging, which is really quite at variance with what typically the United States does, which is strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity, as Biden, I think, on 4 occasions spelled out. That worries me quite a bit. What it means and what other countries would do. Because if this accumulates, if this becomes a pattern, then goodbye NPT. Then you see South Korea first. Japan probably might take a little longer because the public opinion is not quite there. But Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Poland, other countries might all try and get nuclear weapons, not being able to depend on the United States anymore. And that's a very different world in which we would wake up. So yeah, that worries me.
Mm. And our audience, many of them are investors. I mean, how are you positioning yourself in this world? Because it sounds like it's highly uncertain. So do you just go and buy gold or something? Or
no. So I think it makes sense to if we believe that the world is really, really changing and it's something quite drastic could happen very quickly, then it's good to extract call optionality on such a high impact, low frequency event. Because it's low frequency, therefore low probability, if your idea of probability is frequentist, then you cannot really quantify it. But it's good to add it on top. And be my guest. Does it mean shorting Apple? Maybe. Does it mean shorting Fortescue in Australia, or does it mean buying something that would benefit hugely from it, or safe haven, or whatever? It's good to have that over layers somewhere over other elements in your portfolio. I would strongly suggest that's the world where we're going to have volatility coming from different corners that we're not used to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, I did want to round off with a couple of personal questions. One is, what's the best investment advice you've ever received from anyone?
Rather than investment, it's actually trading advice. It's to automate your sales. And here's why. We're probably more emotional when it relates to positions when we have to liquidate. And, our brains function a certain way. So, when emotion is generated in the amygdala, right, in this old reptilian brain, but that's in itself either fear or anger or something. But then afterwards, hypothalamus at the very back there decides whether you fight, fly away, or freeze, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. These are the three. And these three are not just genetic. You decide how you behave during your childhood. And then you transpose it. For example, you hold a position and you can do only three things. You can attack, right? So you can say, buy more of that, or build some kind of option strategy around your position. You can freeze and do nothing, just wait until it goes away, or you can sell and run away, right? So always those three. And therefore, you will have a tendency to go in one of the directions for reasons that have nothing to do with rationality of your portfolio structure. And because that hypothalamus then afterwards, connects with your hormonal system, and, you start trembling and gooseflesh, and you know how it is on a trade floor, people start throwing things at each other, and there's a lot of excitement, or bad excitement. And if you make losses, then this sort of legacy emotions become, much more, cortical. And so it's a very important thing, is just to set your limits and not look back, not to adjust it, and just make sure you actually are not emotionally triggered to exit positions when things change. So that's a trading one. On an proper investment one, it's a bit too technical, but I tend to adjust risk not in the discount rate, but in the cash flow. So in the numerator rather than in the denominator. And that comes from personal experience of how industrial operations function. And that's because I spend quite a lot of time in the industry other than in front of the Bloomberg screen. But that's a long.
Okay, that's
long
great. I love your point about flight, and freeze, and relating that to trading positions. I'm gonna think about that and use that myself. I think about my childhood.
Sounds good.
That's great. Now, the other question I had for you was, we do have some young people in the audience as well. And so what advice would you give to sort of younger people as they think about their careers or their life after they leave university?
Okay, so a lot of people, so there are two types of people, hedgehogs and foxes, right? Like in old Isaiah Berlin's essay. Foxes tend to know a lot of things, hedgehogs know only one thing. If you're a hedgehog, you don't even need to ask me this question. So if you're a fox, here's an answer. I would strongly advise against jumping into consulting, a generalist job, consulting / sell side / big bank, in the hope of then moving to a buy side, or private equity, or hedge fund, or something straight. I would strongly advise to try and learn something, at least about one sector of the economy, and see how value is generated, see the real world, see industry, rather than just straight in front of your screen, and then everything is a derivative of real value, and then derivative of derivative, and the third and the fourth, and so on. Because you'll realize how much depends on people, and the connectivity between people and structure. When we think about, say, capital goods, it's easy to say, well, this is just capital. No, a lot of labor goes into capital goods, right? It's a composite. So people, how they're managed, where is the excellence, where are the mistakes, how to dissociate costs from risks, and so on. You really have to learn it on the ground. So I strongly recommend, if you have a chance to go into anything, it doesn't have to be, sexy, Taiwanese semiconductors, right? And everybody on NVIDIA or something like this. Could be anything. But it's really good to spend some time It's easier for engineers, of course, but different walks of life these days with the demographic changing, there's going to be opportunities, especially in the reindustrializing West. Let's hope. So I strongly recommend not to jump straight into generalist jobs, but do something very concrete. And even if you don't use it every day afterwards, there's going to be a lot of lessons that you'll benefit from the rest of your life.
That's fantastic advice. And then I see you have lots of books behind you. So I have to ask you, what are some of the books that have influenced you?
Okay, well, there's a lot, but we're going to run out of time. Okay, so let me start with that. So there is a book on history that I strongly recommend. It's Europe by Norman Davies. Do you know this? It's a very thick Norman Davies.
Yep.
But the reason being is that he actually doesn't feed you with patterns over, say, 1,000, 2,000 years of history of Europe. Rather, he allows you to connect the dots yourself. And while he writes about it, very different from other traditional writers about history, he doesn't just focus on the big empires. A lot of small moving pieces are also picked up. And so that puzzle you have to rearrange in your mind, both synchronically and diachronically. That was definitely one of the most interesting books about things that happened in the past that I read. In terms of economics, the fairly recent Price of Time, you know this, right? So that's about interest rates and about the lunacy of very low interest rates and what it means, what the distortion is. And I myself, before reading this, looked at some charts related to the 2011, 2012, the capital-less recession or expansion, in which you had near zero interest rates, probably real zero interest rates, and actually no capex whatsoever, right? And therefore, right now at 4 or 5%, you have this push towards reindustrialization. So it shows that it is, what benefited from those low interest rates is just gravity in the big pools and speculative activity, but very little actually meaningful, profitable long-term investments. It's a very good way to actually look into history again and how thinking about it evolved. Part of serious problems that we have right now with imbalances is exactly that, near zero cost of capital in some of those economies. So that's on the market side. In terms of broader kind of thinking, there is The Body and the Mind by Mark Johnson. So it goes very, very far back to my studies when I did cognitive sciences, cognitive linguistics. It's that kind of organizes way in which we capture concepts such as, commodity market X, right? It's a concept, it's a construct, and how it's done in a certain schema, right? So, you as a subject versus the object, different roles and events, and how they're positioned, and what our perceptive structure is like, giving that our perception, our consciousness is embodied. So we are in bodies, and we have this experience, and therefore we function with certain type of metaphors. And I always say, okay, so AI helps us translate everything very easily, because all around this world we have the same bodies. So our language is structured in a certain way. But I think if UFO ever lands here and their bodies are more like octopuses, then even if octopuses have sort of convergence in their eyes, that the eyes are similar to us, everything else is different. So their languages might not be so easily translatable to us, and we'll be in trouble. So yeah, that was a really big one. There are other names, of course, in that tradition, but I'd probably leave it at that. But
that's fantastic. Great sort of range of books there. So
one thing I want to mention, the podcast you mentioned is Tyranny Today, not Tyranny Now. Tyranny Today.
Oh, sorry, Tyranny Today. Yeah, and so I should actually say, I was going to ask, what's the best way for people to learn more about what you're doing? And so one is your podcast. And is there any other places they can go to find your thinking or learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so Tyranny Today is the podcast in which I discuss broader issues, and of course, for accredited investors, I run a fund in New York City, but then of course it's for a limited number of people. So I think the podcast is the best way. Otherwise, they can track me down on LinkedIn.
Great, that's excellent. So with that, thanks a lot. It's been super informative, to go around the world, and good luck ahead of the holidays and everything, and hope you'll do really well in 2025 as well.
Thank you, Bilal. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.